Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. So I've heard from a lot of different people that it's a pretty tough job market at the moment. We've seen a bunch of huge tech companies fire a lot of employees. So I thought maybe now would be a good time to get Jett Metcalf on the show to talk about recruitment. Jett is currently the head of talent at Regrow Ag, but he was also the recruiting manager at Descartes Labs and had a similar role at Google. So I thought Jett would be a really good person to get on the podcast today and talk about applying for a job, getting picked, and how to negotiate a contract. Just before we get started, it's worth mentioning that if you enjoy this episode or if this topic around careers is important to you, go to our website, mapscaping.com/podcasts, and there you can filter the episodes by careers, and hopefully you'll find more episodes that will be interesting and helpful for you. I'll put a link to that in the show notes of this episode. Hi Jett, welcome to the podcast. So my understanding is you are the head of recruiting at a company called Regrow Agriculture, and you've also got this long history within geospatial recruiting specifically. And this is what I'm really interested to talk with you today about. But I think before we get started, would you mind just introducing yourself to the audience, please? And maybe let us know how you got involved as a recruiter and specifically as a recruiter within the geospatial sector.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, thanks for having me, Daniel. And yeah, I maybe I'll just start from the beginning. I really I lucked out to both find a career in recruiting in the first place, and then even got more lucky to find a career in recruiting in geospatial. So, I had started my career in recruiting mostly just working for, staffing solar fields and electricians for construction projects, but had a great opportunity to take some time out at Google, supporting their master's and PhD recruiting specifically. But through this, I had actually supported one group in particular, which is the Geo group within Google, which runs the mapping function, among others. And, around that time, a small company had just raised their Series B round of company by the, Series B round of funding by the name of Descartes Labs. And coincidentally enough, Descartes Labs was actually based where I was from here in New Mexico, which isn't exactly known as a tech hub by any means. So had the opportunity to come right after our Series B round of funding when I knew that there was going to be a lot of positions to be hiring for. And, I was with Descartes Labs for about 4.5 years from that Series B round of funding, grew the company, beyond 100 employees, mixture of scientists, software engineers, and really got to learn a lot about the geospatial industry specifically. And then, yeah, more recently have switched to kind of a downstream geospatial analytics company called Regrow Ag, working on using satellite imagery and Google Earth Engine, among other geospatial insights, to essentially, give better insights to sustainability for the agriculture industry generally. So just working, in my own way to mitigate, my own carbon footprint by hiring people who know what they're doing in the geospatial, agriculture, and software industries. So, yeah, I frankly got lucky, but what I've just really enjoyed is, how interesting the geospatial sector can be, how many different use cases there have been, and frankly, also how nice the people in the industry as well are. That's not always the case. So, it seems everyone comes from a common thread of, being kind on top of just being very very intelligent and interesting to talk to.
It's interesting you say that. That's something I really appreciate about it as well. So, and to be honest, I haven't got that much experience in other industries and other sectors, but I like that people are relatively open in this one. I like that interactions that I have with people online, especially, they seem to lead with kindness. They might not agree with what I'm saying or my point of view, but the point is that it's a discussion as opposed to an argument. I really appreciate that. Wow, you have a breadth of experience in this industry from Google to Descartes Labs to your current position. And I think you mentioned you moved to Descartes Labs during their Series B. So this is relatively early on in the company's history. What was the major difference that you noticed, like moving away from Google, an established big organization, to a company that had just raised their Series B funding round?
It's a really interesting question. And funny enough, I think everyone has this perception, obviously, that the Googles of the world and these large companies just have everything 100% figured out, and that there's such a rigidity to it. And honestly, that wasn't my experience from Google. I think I had, frankly, a fair amount of autonomy and really got to expose myself to a level of recruiting that I appreciated at Google, and obviously learned best practices across the board. They do an incredible time, just making sure everyone's prepared and have enough resources around them. But then transitioning to Descartes Labs, it was so different. I instead of hiring, at Google, I would hire 10 people in a week sometimes.
Wow.
And that was a lot different from Descartes Labs, where we had to be, cautious with how we were spending money and, just kind of making sure that we're putting all of the resources in the right place. But luckily through this, Descartes Labs was such a great entry into geospatial because it really, I got to see some of the best people in the geospatial industry and work with them closely. And, as you had mentioned, kind of that have that kindness that we see in the geospatial industry. So I just had an infinite amount of people who were willing to take the time and teach me what being geospatial industry was like. And we it was a lot different from a resource perspective. We had to figure a lot of things out ourselves. We had to just kind of iterate and see what works, what doesn't work, and be quick to abandon process or add new processes. But really learned a lot of what a less mature company looks like. But I think around the company generally, there's such an attitude of getting things done that everyone was on the same page. So it was surprising how easy it became over time once I had that context for the company, which I think is just a credit to everyone who was there at the time.
So it sounds like you had a lot of help. You talked about like understanding the geospatial world and the help that the kindness you experienced from your colleagues at Descartes Labs. Was it hard to hire for geospatial roles? Like because it sounded like you were in the process of understanding the industry yourself. My guess is that maybe not being a deep expert in it at that stage, and then hiring for geospatial roles. I'm wondering if that was difficult. And let me give some context here. Oftentimes, in geospatial land, we say things like spatial is special. And I'm wondering if it is in terms of hiring for geospatial roles, or is it just like hiring for another, like any other technical role?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think unfortunately I'm gonna have a caveated answer, because it really depends, and there are a lot of different aspects to hiring geospatial, skill sets generally that make it both more difficult as well as less difficult. First and foremost, obviously, the volume of qualified candidates is going to be less in any sort of specialty skill set. Geospatial, of course, among them as well. So there's just a smaller pool to pull from in the appropriate skill sets when you're hiring a geospatial data scientist with remote sensing and mining experience. That's going to be
Yeah.
such a limited pool. But to the advantage, what's interesting is because there's so many common skill sets among these candidates. So when I'm hiring a technical role, say a software engineer or a scientist, and they have to have GDAL experience or GeoPandas experience, any sort of these geospatial skill sets, it narrows it down and it makes my job easier because I know exactly where to look. I can look at geospatial Reddit threads and I can look at a resume and see, yep, this person has GDAL. Great. Let's get them on the phone and, actually talk about it. So it almost has a few different components to it that make it both more difficult from a limited volume perspective, but also easier because it's easier to filter out the non-important skill sets and really focus on the key technical skills that are going to be important for success.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. It's almost sounded like GeoPandas GDAL was a proxy for yes, that this means a geospatial person. In some ways, I guess it is. What else could I do as a candidate to stand out in your eyes, apart from like having these sort of keywords scattered throughout my application? What else are you looking for? How do I stand out? How do I get noticed during the hiring process?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, and I can't emphasize this enough, resume formatting and CV formatting is actually very important because oftentimes the gatekeepers to the roles, in this case, myself, recruiters, don't have the deep technical skill sets to understand the nuances of the projects you're working on. And so we do look for keywords. We look for does this person have these, technical skills that I know are necessary? And they have to be heavily featured on the resume for me to decide to move forward. And as such, resume formatting, clear formatting, and kind of emphasizing the translatable skill sets is incredibly important. But more so, what I've seen with a lot of geospatial candidates is they've worked on a lot of projects over time. And those projects may vary from academic projects to side projects. And oftentimes what I find is, the candidates who have the directly related skills. So in my current role at Regrow Agriculture, I may see an overlap with a yield prediction model that some geospatial data scientist had worked on. And just that one relevant touch point in their background and experience is really important for me to understand, hey, this may be a great candidate who's worked on some very similar problems. And I always, the nuances of cover letters as well. I know many companies do not review cover letters, so I don't want to promise that cover letters will always be removed or reviewed, but it's important because that allows you to kind of speak the story of why you are specifically interested in the company that you're applying for, and that really makes the difference and makes an application stand out.
It's interesting that you mentioned that sometimes you can see the overlap. Are you expecting that you do that work, that you're the one looking for the overlap, putting two and two together, or are you hoping that the candidate shows up and says, "Hey, I know you asked for this. I haven't done this, but here's a similar project. This is the overlap," and have them like show you the overlap?
It really depends, to be honest, and it depends on a lot of actually the macroeconomic climate and what the job hiring, space looks like at the time. Sometimes, depending on how competitive the landscape is, I we won't even receive applications for different roles. So I'll have to go out and seek out those relevant projects and experiences and do what we call as sourcing to find the right candidates in the right experience at the right time, which is a lot more, on me to see those relevant overlap. When the market, such as now, typically favors the employer, it becomes important for candidates to highlight and, differentiate themselves because ultimately it's more of a volume game when the market is kind of in a downturn for candidates generally. So it's important to always highlight, as important as possible, the relevant overlap and skill sets that you have from your previous experience.
And let's say you weren't getting any applications and the market was favoring the candidates and you were out sort of seeking candidates for your role. Where would you be looking at in, like, obviously this depends on the project, but what kinds of things are you looking for?
Yeah, I do a similar type of search from when I'm looking at resumes. So a primary tool that everyone's going to be familiar with is of course LinkedIn, which is still to this date the most important professional networking site generally. And what I'll do is run a keyword search on the back end. A little behind the curtain moment, but a recruiter version of LinkedIn looks quite a bit different than the LinkedIn that most people are going to be aware of. It has a lot of search features and functionality that allows me to filter these candidates appropriately. And as such, I'm able to run essentially a keyword search on my back end to find things using the example again, like GDOL, GeoPandas. It'll run kind of a full scrape of their profile so that I can, only reach out to the most relevant candidate. And then it's just the manual look through all these profiles, see who seems to stick out, and then ultimately, see if I can get them on the phone to sell them on the opportunity.
I think this is a really good insight. I think a lot of people, especially in the technical world, tend to focus on maybe Twitter, and LinkedIn feels a little bit boring, perhaps. But I think if you're looking for a job, it's probably worth then thinking about having some of these keywords and making sure you're documenting your experience and understanding and the tools that you're using in such a way that people like yourself can find you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also think LinkedIn can be quite boring at times, just out of full transparency. But it is really important to have, almost a carbon copy of your resume, specifically the level of detail associated on your resume to be reflected on your LinkedIn. So that regardless if you respond or not, that the recruiters can find you in the proper ways as well. But I do also encourage using more creative channels. When a candidate, messages me on Twitter, frankly, they'll probably have a higher success rate because the volume is going to be lower, and they'll be, specifically seeking out the opportunities that I have. And as such, it makes for a pretty interesting. So I recommend always, kind of pursuing like a composite approach in many ways and try as many channels as possible.
That is really interesting. I think a lot of people would be maybe a little bit not afraid, but like cautious about doing that. Wondering if they're overstepping the mark. But it's really interesting to hear you say that. So we've been talking about how to stand out in the hiring process, and you gave us some good insights there, which I really appreciate. I think maybe we should address the elephant in the room. So lately in tech, there's been a lot of layoffs, and I guess what this has meant. I mean, you know more about this than me, but my guess is this has kind of flooded the market with a lot of very qualified people, very qualified technical people. What are you seeing when you try and hire for geospatial roles? Has this had any effects that you can see?
Yeah, unfortunately, it has. And what we see, as recruitment in tech and specifically in geospatial, is that these, layoffs affect the volume of candidates that we're attracting to any position. Obviously, each of these large tech companies and even smaller geospatial companies have all, changed in size, and they've also changed their hiring outlook. So there are currently less opportunities for software engineers, data scientists, and the market itself is pretty difficult right now, and it is probably more difficult than it has specifically over the last probably 6 years or so. And as such, it's even more important to be able to stand out in an application. So I'll give an example. At my current role, if I were to post a geospatial data scientist position or a geospatial software engineering position, I may attract somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 200 applications in a 48-hour period,
Wow.
which really emphasizes the need to stand out and to use a multi-channel approach, reach out on LinkedIn in addition to applying online and follow all the companies on social medias. And these are the difference makers because when I look at two applications side by side and they're very similar in experience, but I see that this candidate follows us on Twitter and LinkedIn and has liked several posts and just feels like a really engaged candidate. That can be all the difference that's required for me to decide to move forward with X candidate over the one that doesn't have that level of engagement. And more generally in tough job markets like we're seeing today, my biggest recommendation is to stay persistent and to stay patient. It can be extraordinarily frustrating as a job seeker to be denied opportunities, to be rejected, of course, and you really have to remain optimistic through these trying times and find out all of the different opportunities that you're interested in seeking out. Maybe now's a time to consider a career change into a different role or to bring on new responsibilities. Take a certificate program that may be directly applicable to the job you're pursuing. It's a good opportunity to really kind of make sure that you're positioning yourselves correctly because in a tough job market, you have to be very, very competitive.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's fascinating that within 48 hours that you can expect to get 200 applications. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's I can check my inbox some days and I'm just like, "Oh no, how am I how am I going to do this?"
Yeah. Yeah, I guess from your side, it's also overwhelming, although my guess is that you could probably pretty quickly filter out a good chunk of those, but still, it's a lot of people to consider.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to ask a question around being over and underqualified. I'm sort of hoping that you can help people understand, when am I overqualified? When am I underqualified? Because when I think about a job, a role, a position, I think like sometimes I'll be overqualified for some of the things I'm doing, and sometimes I'll be underqualified. But it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on it. Like, when do you think, or is there anything we should be thinking about when we're applying for a position and we're like, oh, I don't know where I land on this scale here, on this spectrum?
It's a great question, and, I hate to once again give a "it depends" answer, but it really does depend on quite a few different things. So, when we have a level associated with a role, obviously senior, junior, mid-career, just a few common examples. There's a few reasons why we have it leveled, which is either the nature of the work, if the work is low level and suited for someone just starting in, say, their like data engineering, geospatial data engineering career, and the nature of the work isn't that complicated and is more suitable for a junior level employee. We oftentimes are seeking specifically those junior level employees because we know that the type of work is going to be more suitable for that level of experience. And then, of course, the financial aspects as well. Sometimes I only have X budget for this role. And so I know that means that it's going to be a more junior candidate. Or if that budget is, quite a bit larger, maybe we can bring on a senior or even a principal data scientist. And it really kind of depends on a few factors of, the seniority level. But for you yourself as a job seeker, specifically when you're seeking opportunities with smaller companies, I would always hesitate to recommend excluding yourself from an opportunity. And so oftentimes, maybe a junior data scientist position's opened up at a small company and a senior data scientist is interested in the company but is nervous about being overqualified for the role. Oftentimes, I'd probably recommend to still apply to those roles and specifically maybe reach out to a recruiter or any connections that you have within the company to mention, hey, I feel like I might be overqualified for this position, but I'm so interested in X role and X company that I thought I'd at least reach out. And I think that allows for a much more flexible opening into the companies that you're seeking employment for, because oftentimes, on the back end, I'm just trying to fill whatever positions I have on my plate. And although I may have a junior data scientist position opened up, I may know that there is a senior or a principal data scientist that's opening up just in a couple weeks. And as such, by excluding yourself from the opportunity, I won't have the opportunity to be like, oh, yeah, I have that senior role that's opening up in a month. Let me take this call with this candidate. So I'd recommend oftentimes to try and not disqualify yourself for being underqualified or overqualified, and frankly put the agency on the company to make that decision for you. That way you at least have some exposure into the company generally.
So I think this makes a lot of sense. And when you're talking about junior, senior, and principal, data scientists in this case, yeah, it makes sense to sort of divide the roles up. That depending on the task that you have at hand, the task that needs to be done, and maybe the compensation that's available at the moment. And I can see how either you can sort of decide whether you're underqualified or overqualified for those particular roles. But what about if you're moving to somewhere new? So you're a technical person and you're wanting to move into a leadership role, or perhaps a less technical role. How do you decide, and this is like from both sides of the coin, how do you decide whether I'm underqualified or overqualified for this? Because I think, people grow and develop during their careers, and it's not unthinkable that technical people might want to become less technical and more involved in the leadership side of things.
Yeah, it's a great question. And oftentimes, right, we see that a lot. People who are interested in changing their role, changing their responsibility, and what we still look for are kind of those translatable skill sets. So I'll give an example, two examples probably. Say we have a junior data scientist who wants to switch into like a sales engineering role. That's a pretty common, kind of transition that we see specifically for geospatial data scientists. And so when I'm looking at, an application from a junior data scientist for a sales engineer, I know the sentiment right away, right? Obviously, I can see that they're hoping to maybe make a change. And so what I'm looking for are still kind of those translatable skill sets. So oftentimes I'll look, have they seemingly had any customer interaction in their roles? Have they focused on customer projects? Have they done demos for different scientific projects, and still looking for those translatable skill sets. But oftentimes, when you are pursuing a career change, you have to be much more intentional about how you present your information so that that intentionality about changing careers, say, if you're an individual contributor hoping to switch into a management track, you're going to need to be more intentional about how you present that information. So you can use things like objective statements in resumes. Obviously, as I had mentioned, cover letters are actually probably a great opportunity to really get that point of across of, hey, I've spent the last 7 years as an individual contributor. I've maybe led technical projects, but now I want to get into people management. And you have to, speak that intentionality through cover letter, through these opportunities. And then you do just have to be more patient, is what I'd refer to, because you may be competing against candidates that have direct related experience. But if it's something that you really want to pursue, you need to just kind of speak with that intentionality of why you're hoping to make that change. And then one more point that I'd like to add is oftentimes what we see is changing company sizes is actually a great opportunity to, change actually your career trajectory. So if you're, at a small, startup or, small company, there's going to be a lot more flexibility in your role and, assignments day to day. But it'll give you good exposure to the skill sets that then you can, go to a larger company that has more training programs and more resources accessible to, potentially change careers and, kind of use this composite approach of small company and large company to kind of gain the skill sets that you're really seeking for.
That is a really good insight. That sounds like a great idea. I want to stay on this topic just for a second here. And I'm wondering if you can give us an understanding of how much experience plays into your decision and how much qualifications play into your decision when we think about making a change from perhaps a technical role to a leadership position. And I wonder, I hope you understand the question here. But if I have experience, you talked about experience kind of things before, leading projects, giving customer demos, that kind of thing. How do you weigh that against something like I've done a lot of courses, I've been on a leadership course and participated in this sort of official qualification?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and to that point, I think maybe an important thing to realize is that myself as a recruiter and any person in recruiter are essentially, we have customers, which are our hiring managers. And these hiring managers are the, individuals that have to make the final decision on the candidates that we end up hiring. And as a result, what I have to do as a recruiter is to understand the tolerance level of the hiring manager that I'm supporting. Do they emphasize what skill sets are most important for them? Are they open to bringing from non traditional backgrounds? And that's going to vary from person to person, from department to department. And it's kind of a learning experience to understand what hiring managers are specifically looking for. Myself, what I look for is kind of a composite. And I kind of use that word a lot of I'm not looking for any one thing, but instead I'm looking for enough touch points for what I'm really evaluating for, whether that comes from, obviously on the side of like technical experience doing exactly the right job that I'm looking for, or hey, I see that they're a software engineer, but they've taken these leadership courses and they've taken these online courses. So I can see kind of that intentionality and that thread that runs through their profile and experience. And depending on what my hiring manager is really looking for, that's where I can understand, hey, they're open to someone who doesn't have direct management experience, but is headed in that direction. So then that allows me to have the flexibility to reach out for those slightly less traditional candidates.
This is really interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is that you're in the middle. You sound almost like a real estate agent where someone is selling a house on one side and someone's buying a house on the other side, and you're the go-between. I think up until now, in my mind, you were the end stop. You were the person that made the final decision. But I think that this adds an extra dynamic to the situation for me. So I appreciate you walking us through that. Right at the start of the conversation, we talked about those differences between going from a big, well-established company to a startup. Do you see differences when you hire for these different kinds of organizations as well? And if you do, maybe you could walk us through some of them. What are you looking for if you're hiring for Google, and what are you looking for if you're hiring for a startup?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what there is a much more tolerance for large companies. And I say that because they have essentially just more resources in place to absorb candidates from those non-traditional backgrounds or that have kind of different types of skill sets generally. Which is why I do recommend that, larger companies are a great entry point for early stage or transitioning candidates because it's almost a landing spot where you can learn the proper skill sets. But I always also recommend not to get into the the trap of staying too large of companies. If things like startups and everything are an interest to you, you want to make sure that you don't get too stuck in how a large company operates because it is quite a bit different, from these smaller companies. But to that end, when I'm hiring for a large company such as Google, or even previously when I would staff for even solar fields and things like that, I knew it was going to be a volume game. And what I would look for is I knew I could get 100, if not 1,000. I mean, at Google we would average. I don't even know how many applications per day, and as such, I knew it was never going to be an absence in the quality of candidates. Whereas, at a smaller company, we do just have to be more intentional. We have to see those types of skill sets. We have to do more outreach to find the right candidates. It's just a different, skill set altogether where larger companies are going to have a higher tolerance, and then smaller companies just need to fill the position as soon as possible because when a startup posts a position, you know that something's probably on fire on the back end. And there's some pipeline that stopped working and no one knows exactly what's going wrong. And there's just a sense of urgency, which is both a really maybe stressful, I can say that, but also really rewarding environment to see that, tangible one to one. We're hiring this person to solve X problem as well.
When you describe it like that, it doesn't sound like just a question of finding the right candidate in terms of the hard skills. It also sounds like finding the right candidate in terms of the soft skills. Who's going to take ownership for this thing here? Who is not too proud to get their hands dirty and be expected to do a wider range of jobs? At least that's what I think of when I listen to you talk. Am I on the right track?
Definitely. I think that the soft skills are oftentimes the most important, aspect of any candidate. And it may depend slightly on the role. If it's, an individual contributor working on kind of an isolated project, it might, matter less those soft skills. We just need the hard technical skills that can get the technical project done, but oftentimes I find that that's not really the case because with any technical role, there's going to be teamwork, collaboration. There's going to be a context that's required to be truly successful in that role. And I can speak to my current company now, Regrow Agriculture, and we receive a lot of interest. There's obviously a lot of interest in the climate tech space right now. So people with geospatial backgrounds and software engineering are seeking out climate opportunities. And it allows us to be somewhat selective. And one of the main criteria that we really select against is, can this technical candidate speak to the customer? And that's really a skill set that's really important. I think individual contributor software engineers and, frankly, even things like geospatial data scientists lose the broader context of who is paying for us to do this work, and instead they're so focused on, well, I use the cutting edge machine learning tool to do object segmentation on satellite imagery, which is obviously super cool and a really exciting project. But the difference between that candidate who's done this deeply technical, skill set versus the one who knows, hey, I had to ship a project in 2 weeks because the customer needed X, so I didn't have time to do a full deep learning model. I just came up with a statistical model that made sense for the application in the time that I was given. And that type of context and customer kind of focus is really a huge difference maker. And I would encourage any scientist or engineer or deeply technical, especially geospatial person, to start to absorb that context, understand what customers are doing, talk to your salespeople and really kind of get that broader context, because that can make a huge difference for accessibility into the market generally.
Would you? I'm curious. Would you give the same kind of advice to academics that were looking to leave academia and move into the private sector?
That's probably the biggest recommendation I would give to academia. It's always going to be tough. Obviously, we know academics have to be focused in their applications, because they have to publish, they have to focus, they have to work with their PIs and everything. But the most successful academics who are transitioning out of academia are going to be the ones who can still not even necessarily know the context, because obviously it's going to be very different in industry rather than academia, but rather just be able to speak to, that customer context. And oftentimes, I talk with a lot of geospatial academics, and the ones who can speak to why they're really hoping to transition out of academia because they want to see that tangible customer impact and really kind of pursue industry opportunities for the right reasons, I think can make a huge difference. And oftentimes, what I still look for are kind of those translatable use cases. So an academic may not be working with, a large enterprise customer, of course, but they still have a team of stakeholders that they have to do to push out research and timelines and project management. And so I still look for kind of those soft skill sets, and I hope that they can translate the differences between industry and academia because they they run at a different pace is what I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure they do. Okay, so I think you've given us a lot of great insight in what you're looking for, depending on the kind of role you're trying to fill and some of the challenges around it, and I really appreciate that. I wonder if we could move on and sort of think about post-selection process. So you've found a person that you want to work with, that you want to hire, and it's time to negotiate a contract. Are you expecting candidates to negotiate?
It's a good question, and it really depends on the role. And I'll, I'll say specifically when I'm hiring a junior geospatial data scientist, for instance, I'm probably anticipating a little bit less negotiation than if I'm hiring a sales executive. For instance, I know that that's going to come with 10 versions of that offer, and really you seeing that skill set of negotiation live with the sales folks. But I am expecting negotiation. I think specifically over the last probably 5 to 6 years, we've seen that there's been an increase in agency and transparency around pay for candidates and the broader job market. And with that becomes a lot more empowered candidates. So oftentimes when I'm approaching an offer stage with a candidate, I'm frankly expecting the candidate to probably do some negotiation. But how that negotiation goes is really important for the candidate and for the company itself, because if you have a lot of opportunities to increase your total compensation package, but it is still a delicate topic, and you really need to make sure you're pursuing that negotiation with the right intention, to make sure that you're not going to burn any bridges when you're at the offer stage. And my biggest recommendation to candidates is to try and be as transparent around compensation and negotiation as soon as possible. The best recruiters will ask those types of questions almost immediately in your candidacy, and ask, what your compensation expectations are, and, what's important to you as far as the next opportunity. And I do recommend to be as transparent as possible. Your recruiter in many ways is almost your partner to candidates. I think there's a lot of attitude that your recruiter is almost your gatekeeper to the opportunity. But me as a recruiter, if I could pay people whatever they wanted, I would, because I would just get the job done and I'd get to move on to the next role. But that's obviously not the reality that we can operate in. But we still have the candidate's best interest in mind. And so by being transparent and to be respectful to the recruiter that you're working with is going to be really important down the line when you do have that offer to, say, hey, Jet, I really am excited about this opportunity. This is great. I was wondering, what portions of this offer are going to be negotiable. Can I, ask for an increase to the base salary? Can I ask an increase for stock options? Is there a trade-off between those two? What are the benefits package? And kind of having that transparency and forthrightness as soon as possible is really important for candidates.
How do I do this, like, as a candidate and not come across as just being greedy and entitled? Because, I think we're still building when we're in this process, we're still testing each other out. No one's signed any documents yet. We're building a relationship together. And I think you were stressing earlier that the idea here is to not burn the bridges, to be cautious and approach this in the most respectful way possible. So, how do I not sound, like just an entitled, greedy person that just wants everything?
Yeah, it's a good question, and those people are out there, although they are, luckily pretty infrequent. But what I would recommend doing is to really pursue communication around compensation very delicately. And one of the biggest, if not pretty simple tactic is to emphasize your interest in the position before bridging the topic of, negotiation. So if you send me a recruiter an email that says, "Hey, I need at least $100,000 more for this opportunity to be even remotely interesting to me," that's obviously going to be a pretty aggressive turnoff, and may dictate a different outcome from what you're expecting. But instead, if you pursue it respectfully and say, "Hey, Jet, I'm super excited about this position. This is exactly the type of company, industry, position that I'm interested in, but I have to have it make sense for me financially." And then having data-driven decisions. So we all have connections into the industry. We all have access to Google. We all have access to things like Glassdoor, although I'd recommend probably taking Glassdoor with a heavy grain of salt if you're trying to get salary data from it. But use all of the resources available to you to understand what your potential market value is. That way, you can understand when you receive an offer where that falls in the spectrum of competitiveness. And then using your recruiter as a partner and approaching it respectfully, say, "Hey, I'm excited about this opportunity, but I did see that, for US based data scientists, that this salary is a little bit more indicative of my level of skill set. What do you think about that? Is it possible? What aspects of the offer are negotiable?" That way you have all of the pieces in place to make the proper negotiations.
Let's pretend for a second that pay wasn't negotiable. What else should I be focusing on then? if I can't focus on the salary?
Yeah, so if salary is not negotiable, which, happens with somewhat frequency, you're going to ask if there are other aspects to the offer that are negotiable. Things may be equity is an oftentimes a easier lever to pull for companies because it's obviously tied to the long-term value of the company. So you're going to want to see if equity or stocks are negotiable. There's also bonus structures that may be accessible to you, so, you may be able to increase the percentage of a yearly bonus. You may also be able to negotiate a bonus at all. You want to understand if signing bonuses are part of the company culture. I'll speak to my current company. We don't have signing bonuses and we never have, but many companies utilize signing bonuses to overcome those hesitancies around salary negotiations. And then some more creative ones as well are going to be benefits as well. You're probably not going to be able to negotiate like a higher retirement contribution. Those things are oftentimes more standard, but you may be able to negotiate things like learning and development stipends or different kind of more perks associated with the role that may be negotiable from company to company. And that's really how I recommend pursuing negotiation is to frankly just ask your recruiter, what aspects of the offer are negotiable. That way you are working with the maximum amount of knowledge of what can be changed, even if it's not salary.
And just so I'm clear, when do you think I should start asking these questions? How early is too early, and how late is too late?
It's a good question. So oftentimes, as I had mentioned, the best recruiters will, broach that topic as soon as your first call with the candidate because they need to know those things to understand where you are leveling from, where you're coming from as far as salary expectations, which are very important early on in the process. So you can expect sometimes to have these discussions around salary as soon as your first call with a recruiter, which can be off putting, which is why I recommend doing as much research into these topics prior to applying as possible. That way you can kind of move with as much knowledge. But as far as once you're understanding what aspects of the offer is negotiable, oftentimes I'd recommend before an on-site or if you're, getting indications that, this next discussion is going to be your final round of interviews, I'd probably recommend at that time, so pre on-site or pre-final interview, to have another discussion with the recruiter as your primary point of contact to ask those questions and just say, "Hey, I know we're approaching the end of the interview process. This has been great to learn more about the company and the culture, but I'd just like to have a little bit more thorough discussion about the salary to understand what flexibility there may be." And the reason why I recommend to do it at this point is because some companies may turn around an offer after a final round of interviews very quickly. And depending on what you said during that initial touch point, they may turn around an offer with a set number almost immediately after a final round of interview. And if that's the case, your negotiation can prove more difficult because they already have a number in mind from that first conversation. So instead, I'd recommend right before that final interview or on site interview to have that other discussion with the recruiters to understand and kind of position yourself more correctly for negotiations should that conversation go well.
Yeah, well, that sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. Do you have any stories around when negotiations have gone wrong? I think a few examples here would really cement this in people's minds. What we should be trying to avoid, and what we should be looking out for.
Yeah, and luckily, I continue to support a lot of good hiring managers. So luckily, the horror stories, if you will, have been pretty few and far between, but they're out there and they exist, and I've experienced probably more than my fair share of them. I've had it both ways, where candidates have really really tried to heavily negotiate. I've had some offers go to, 6 or 7 revisions, of the offer because they were essentially playing a negotiation game with many companies. So they would get an offer from us, and then they would take it to their other late stage company and say, "Hey, I have an offer with this number? Can you match it? And then play that game back and forth quite a bit. And that can work out to the candidate's favor sometimes, but I do recommend you need to make sure that you understand what you're valuing in an opportunity. If it's exclusively money, that's great. I wish you all the best, and I hope you enjoy your FANG career at Facebook and Google because those are the only companies who are able to really be extraordinarily competitive with that salary. But instead, if you are interested in those smaller companies or, those startups especially, you have to understand what you're valuing in an opportunity so that you're not playing these negotiation games. Because frankly, I have had some hiring managers who hear that a negotiation is happening and they have done the research themselves and they've decided that this budget is exactly appropriate for the role and it's exactly appropriate for the candidate that they're hoping to hire. And frankly, and I will say this isn't at my current company, so I can give them a break specifically, but they've pulled the offer. If a negotiation is handled with disrespect or feels exploitative, it is always a possibility that a hiring manager may rescind an offer. It is not common practice because obviously, by the time that we're making an offer, we really do want to have you come on board, but it does happen. And you just have to make sure that you, regardless of if you are negotiating, you have to be careful and you have to be respectful in your negotiation because you never know how the decision makers on the other side are really going to react. And so if if you receive an offer that's 50% less than what you were expecting, that may be a chance for you to pull out of the interview process, but you're likely never going to be able to negotiate doubling your salary, for instance, or even, adding 40 to 50% to a salary. So by having those conversations, by knowing the market as early on as possible, you may understand, hey, maybe I can negotiate a 10% increase. But then, most importantly, doing that respectfully and with the recruiter as your partner and stakeholder in the negotiations to make sure that, that type of negotiation doesn't go bad. And I've had candidates try and negotiate and then they lose out on the opportunity. So you just really have to be careful and respectful of how you're approaching it, which isn't that hard. And that's what I'd like to say. And, I would recommend for candidates to try and negotiate, but I'd recommend doing it as soon as possible throughout the process and as respectfully as possible, because that's going to lead to a better outcome. And I think it'll be very rare that someone will have their offer rescinded, but it is a possibility.
When I'm listening to you, I'm thinking there must also be a danger in pushing it too far and getting the offer, but leading to this like bad blood between between the colleagues. Like because I guess you got to keep remembering, well, I've got to work with these people.
Yep.
I might get what I want here and now, but if that's going to lead to like a terrible relationship for the next 5 years, is it worth it?
Yeah, I would definitely keep that in mind as you're negotiating, and it's a conversation that happens with the hiring manager and the recruiter. So, if I as a recruiter am working with a candidate who's asking for, say a 25% increase to their base salary and wants to see if there's a bonus plan available to them, I might take that to the hiring manager, and very often that hiring manager may be, well, they were great through the interview process, but we've only spoken with them over, 5 hours. We really have no indication of, how they're actually going to translate their skill sets into what we're doing here. And oftentimes they can be held almost on a pedestal to higher expectations because of that negotiation. Whereas if it's a junior data scientist who we, pay $60,000 no matter what, and we know they're going to be able to do the job. That may be a different factor. Whereas if it's a senior software engineer who's negotiating to a principal level software engineer, with that level increase, there's going to be an increase to the expectations. So you want to make sure that when you're negotiating to a level that your skill set is frankly going to be matching those expectations and skills.
Whew, wow. We've come a long way in this conversation. I particularly appreciate this last bit here around negotiation. I think this is interesting stuff, and I'm glad that you have taken the time to share with some of your insights with us. If we step back now and we think about hiring in general, do you ever hire like freelancers on like per project basis? Have you seen that happening in the geospatial world, almost like as a test period? Okay, let's hire them on for this while and then move into being a full time employee, or is it always that sort of standard hiring process that most of us have been through before, where there's an interview phase, there's maybe some tests, there's a negotiation, then you get the job, and then you're a full-time employee.
It's a good question, and it varies so much. And so, Regrow Ag, for instance, before our Series B round of funding, there was a lot of contract work, there was a lot of freelance work, and there were a lot of opportunities to get on in non-traditional aspects. And that's very common for smaller companies, because it is, working on X project that needs to get done, and then, move on to the next thing, which requires a flexibility that's more suitable for freelance work or contract work, consultant work. Around, the Series B round of company where it's, 100 plus employees, you're probably going to see less flexibility in that, to be honest, because instead, around that stage of company is where you start to invest in the long term vision of what you want your employee base to look like. And if there's such a different composite of who makes up your company base between freelancers and contractors and full-time employees, it can kind of create a confusing vision in some ways. So oftentimes around this stage, you'll start to see more of an investment in those kind of traditional roles and everything as well. But I always, recommend there's a lot of opportunities, for freelancers and consultants, specifically for things like design work or product management, product consulting. There's a lot of opportunities to really come in these non traditional aspects, but you just have to be much more creative in how you seek out those opportunities. Reach directly out to the department head and say, "Hey, I'm a freelancer working on design work. I noticed that this form is broken on your contract entry form. I'd be interested in helping out." You have to be a little bit more creative and a little bit more salesy to seek out those opportunities, but ultimately they are out there.
I think that's difficult to do, but I could definitely see the value in it. Instead of waiting for the other person to discover you and what you could do, how you could help them, of course, it makes a lot more sense to reach out yourself. Ooh, but I can imagine that imposter syndrome showing up in people and making it difficult, to take the first step yourself.
Definitely.
Hey, Jet, I think this is probably a great time to round off the conversation. And I just want to say I've really enjoyed this. I really appreciate it. I think hiring, recruitment, and especially negotiation is something that most people don't talk about, but obviously it's a big part of having a career. So thank you very much for sharing some of your insights around this topic. Much appreciated. Where can people go if they listen to this and think, oh, you know what, I really need to ask this guy more questions. I want to contact him. I want to see what he's up to. Is there anywhere where we can point people towards?
Yeah, there's 2 places, primarily. Well, A, if you go to any geospatial career fair, you're probably likely to see me, give my spiel, but you can always find me on LinkedIn. That's gonna be the most common place to find me. It's where I respond, hopefully, to as many messages as possible, though the volume can be difficult, but that's a great place to, follow myself, as well as the companies I work for. Alternatively, you can find me on Twitter at Jet Recruits Geo is the Twitter account, but you may have to deal with more basketball knowledge and not exclusively just geospatial recruiting. So I'll leave it to you if you want to go down that route.
Just as a favor to the audience, I think it's important they know this. If I accidentally misspell your name and refer to you as Jeff instead of Jet, will you still reply?
It's a good question. I have been called Jeff probably 5,000 times in my career. So I'm typically pretty fine with it now. Now, if we've been working together for a month through a recruitment process, and then you call me Jeff, that may be a different discussion. But it happens all the time.
Right. Well, again, appreciate the insight. Thank you very much, Jet.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.
Really hope you enjoyed that episode with Jett Metcalf. As usual, there'll be links in the show notes to a few different episodes that are relevant to this one, and also to where you can reach out to Jett, where you can catch up with him on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks very much for tuning in all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. As always, I'll be back again next week. I hope that you take the time to join me then. Cheers.